In this video, I'm going to talk about 3 important components to drawing realistic fur with colored pencils. When you're drawing fur with colored pencils, you're basically duplicating the same process over and over again. Once for the base layer, once for the midtones, and once for the shadows. Give or take a few repeats though, because some fur types require multiple shades of midtones and shadows. When you're drawing fur, probably the most important thing to understand about it is that you are drawing in layers, and if you can't get enough layers into your fur, then your drawing's not going to look realistic. And let's go ahead and get into what those layers are exactly. Now, when you're working with colored pencils, if you've been working with them for long enough, you'll have enough experience with them to know that colored pencils in itself is a bunch of layers. But when it comes to drawing fur, you're going to be doing extra layers. So you got your layers for just colored pencils, then you've also got your layers for the buildup of fur. Now, usually the way that I draw my fur, and I'm sure that it goes common knowledge across a lot of different artists as well, but you need to have layers with your fur to create depth. And the way you're going to get proper depth in your drawings of furry animals is by having a good base layer. And when you're working in colored pencils, you need to work from light to dark, usually. I mean, there are some subjects where you might be using a darker paper or a toned paper, and then of course the types of colors you would want to choose would be a little bit different than when you're working in white colored paper. But assuming that you're working on white colored paper, you're going to be working from light to dark. So what you want to do is make sure that when you're working in your base layer, which is the first layer, of course, onto your paper, and that's just how I refer to it, as base layer, you want to make sure that you're trying to pick out the lightest sections in the subject that you're trying to draw, if it's still life or if it's a reference photo. Pick out the hairs that are the lightest in the section that you're planning on working on. And then you're going to try to match that on your paper. So you want to make sure you get the color right, as well as the most important thing is really the value. It's not necessarily the color, it's actually the how light or dark it is. And in order to have a nice realistic drawing, you do actually need to be very, very accurate in the values that you put into your work. Now, learning how to get proper values is a bit of a learning curve with drawing, because it does take a lot of time and practice to get it right and be able to have that going for all of your drawings once you kind of grasp the concepts of how to get that with your drawings. Now, another thing when you're working in with these base layers is that oftentimes with my work, it will be just one standard blurred color, like you can kind of see here on this drawing I'm working on of a husky's eyes and face. And then I do have some of my base layers down for some of the sections of fur. And what I've picked out is just some of the color and of course the lighter values for those sections. And sometimes it will be like this, and then there are other times where I would be drawing fur for other types of animals, and I would be working in actual fur stroke layers. It wouldn't just be a blob of color, although oftentimes it usually is blobs of colors for the base layer, but in some instances on lighter subjects, not necessarily this husky, but lighter colored animals where you would be doing pretty much white or lighter colored gray fur types, that's when you would probably want to try and do a more layer stroke layer instead of trying to do these blobby base layer shapes to get the correct values in for those highlighted sections. So all these sections that I have down here are going to be highlighted sections. So there's different areas of the dog. There's parts that are black, there's parts that are white, and then there are parts, of course, which they're a little bit darker gray, not necessarily white. And each one of those is different, of course, so there's different colors and a little bit of different values for each one. So I am trying to match for each one of those sections what those values are with my base layer. Now this husky that I'm drawing is available as a full-time tutorial over on my Patreon. By signing up for my $5 tier, you can gain access to it and other drawing tutorials. Each of my tutorials comes with a reference photo and color sheet with the colors used in the tutorial so that you can follow along and learn to draw. I'll have a link to my Patreon in the video description. So working with fur, you of course need to bring out 3 different tonal values to have it look realistic. You need a light undertone, which would be your highlights, your midtones, and shadows. So with those midtones, it is important that you try to get those as accurate as possible, because it does hurt your drawing in the end if you're off with your values. And having those midtones, they aren't quite as important as the highlights and shadows of your work, but then again, it is also important to have those midtones very close in how they are in the reference photo or still life that you're referring to for your drawing. Usually with my drawings, trying to get the mid-tone values in, I usually pick at least 2 different colors. I'll have, say, a lighter mid-tone and a darker mid-tone, and I'll do fur stroke layers with both of those as I'm building my fur. So I'll have my base layer, and I'll have my blobby colors down for the first layer. Then I may or may not have a secondary layer there to add some stroke details in using those lighter colors that I was using for the base layer. That way I've got a little bit of fur detail built into that base layer, as well as of course the highlights that would be showing through where I didn't draw those hair details. Then with the mid-tone layer, I'll do kind of the same thing. Draw a first fur stroke layer using a lighter tone, and then I would use a maybe slightly darker tone or press harder with the same color for that second fur stroke layer. Now it's important when you're choosing the mid-tone values for your fur that it isn't the same value or same color as the highlights of your fur, the first couple of layers, the colors that you're using for those. It needs to be at least, I would say, 3 to 4, maybe 5 shades darker than what you used for your highlights to make sure that there's enough of a difference between both of those values so it makes your fur start to pop. Now your fur won't start looking super realistic once you get to this point in the drawing. It's actually once you start adding in those shadow layers that the fur actually starts to come to life. So now we're going to move on into that other part of the values, and that would be the shadows. So for your shadows, you want to pick at least 2 different shades for shadows. So you want one that's slightly lighter, and then one, of course, that's slightly darker. And usually, unless you're working on a black animal, you don't want black to be your darkest tone. Black should be like a separate additive color to darken anything up that you can't get dark using colors. So I'll pick a darker shade of, say, for this husky, a gray. So I'll pick maybe a darker cold gray, and then I'll pick a lighter cold gray. And if there's not enough diversity between those 2 colors and I'm stuck with one color, usually what I'll end up doing is do a super light initial layer with that darker gray, and then I'll go over the top of that and make another fur stroke layer, but press a little harder with that pencil to get a darker color into it. And that way I've built those 2 tonal values for the shadows in there and created some of that depth that the fur needs. And then oftentimes after doing those first 2 layers for the shadows, I'll have to come back through and maybe even do a 3rd layer. And with the 3rd layer though, I'll usually draw in some darker strokes than I previously got before that, but I'll focus more on trying to create the next thing that I'm going to bring up, and that is unevenness. So this would be the second component to fur, and that is you need it to look uneven and going in different directions, because that really is like one of the key things to making fur look realistic. Time and time again, I will see other people's artwork and looking at their animals that they're drawing, the first thing that comes straight to my mind when I'm looking or critiquing other artworks is that the fur looks way too uniform. All those hairs look way too evenly spaced. They look too much the same length, and they're all going too much in that same direction. There's no diversity whatsoever, and it looks very stiff and unnatural. So when you're trying to create some of those shadow layers, or even just, you need to practice this with all of your fur stroke layers and trying to make sure that they are uneven. They overlap each other. They crisscross here and there. You don't want anything to be uneven. And when I'm going through my drawing processes for my fur, oftentimes I will have some fur stroke layers that are kind of too uniform, and I'll go through and do another layer over the top of that later and kind of correct some of that problem, I guess you could say. I was trying to think of the right word. But so I'll notice that there's areas of my fur that looks way too stiff and uniform. So I'll come back over that and draw strokes to throw it off, make it look uneven, and another word you could say is kind of asymmetrical. So another thing to add to the unevenness of fur, and that's what you should be aiming for, is that fur tends to clump together. So when you are drawing those fur strokes in there to try and make your fur look more uneven, you need to think about the fact that there are often multiple hairs kind of starting in one section, and they kind of split off in a little bit of different directions, or sometimes the hairs crisscross. And when you're drawing your fur stroke layers, you need to try and incorporate this into your fur as well so that you can create more realistic fur. And one thing you should also keep in mind too, I guess this should be like a little bonus here, but is that what you are usually drawing when it comes to fur is you're not actually drawing the fur strokes. What you're drawing, you're not drawing the hairs. You are drawing the shadows of the hairs. And when you kind of understand that you're drawing the shadows of the hairs, what you're actually trying to work for in your fur is structure, and you're trying to shape those highlights into looking like hairs, what you're actually leaving uncovered, or your previous layers uncovered that you're adding the new darker color over the top of. So the third component to fur in your fur looking realistic would have to be direction. And this kind of ties into the previous one of unevenness. One of the common mistakes that I see with fur is getting the wrong direction. And with animals, just one of the ways you can really help yourself is to just study photos, even your own personal photos of your own animals, your dogs, cats, whichever pets you have, and the photos you take of them. Just study the different directions that the fur grows on their faces. The face, I think that probably the fur changes directions 15 to 20 times on a dog's face in a whole bunch of little different areas. And you need to try and incorporate that into your drawings as well to help it look realistic. And not only just the direction, but you also need to make sure you have the lengths correct too, because there's a lot of little tiny hairs when you're starting out in the areas around the eyes and the nose. And in those areas, there really are a lot of minuscule directional changes too. So not only do the hairs need to be small, but you need to be paying attention to how often or exactly where those hairs start to change direction. And when you can get those accurate in your drawings, that is really going to help them look realistic. You can learn more fur drawing tips from the top right video, and you can also learn to draw wildlife and pets with colored pencils from my real-time 1 to 15 hour drawing tutorials with a voiceover of tips and explanations over on Patreon. Signing up gives you instant access to a growing library of tutorials, and new ones are added each month. I'll have a link in the video description. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.